Hello everyone, I'm currently traveling for an event for Dragon Age the Veilguard. I can't talk about it until the 19th, but when that day comes around, you better believe I'm going to have a lot to say on the game. That being said, I haven't been able to stream like I normally would, but I still want to talk about games with all of you, so here I am, you're stuck with me. I wanted to talk briefly about Astro because the reviews just dropped like however long ago, hours ago, and it's popping off, which doesn't like really surprise anybody, I don't think. Like, I think we all knew this was going to be really, really good just based on the trailers. But I do think it's really interesting in the context of what's going on with PlayStation more broadly, because PlayStation is doing that weird thing. I can't really pull up MS Paint right now, which I want to desperately. But, you know, they basically had established that they were spending this much on games, and then they were like, oh, we want to spend even more on games, so we're going to double that. We're just going to do this times 2. And that sounds great, but that second chunk of funding was all just going into live service stuff. You know, they were pouring tons and tons of money. They still are hundreds of millions of dollars into live service production. And they've had Helldivers, which has been a success. Granted, it's fallen off pretty steeply recently, but it's still, I think, by most metrics, it's still a successful live service game. Even now, after calming down a good bit, it's still successful. It's just not like as ridiculously successful as it was when it launched, but still successful. But that being said, they've had that, and then everything else has been an unmitigated disaster for PlayStation. Like, of course, Concord is the most recent one you can point to, which was just another level, like literally probably the biggest flop in corporate gaming history, like AAA gaming history. I don't think there's been another game that has lost as much money as that game. Like, it was unbelievably uninteresting to customers. Like, I don't think it was the worst game ever, but I think players just didn't care. And that's the one thing about games that are bad, is at least with some bad games, people care and are like curious, morbidly curious to check it out. Like even Suicide Squad had that, where people bought it just because they wanted to see, like, well, I'll see for myself. I like Batman stuff. I'll check it out. And they played it, got through it in 7 hours or whatever, and we're like, yep, no, not great. And then they moved on, and they're like, I shouldn't have spent my money on that, but oh well. With Concord, just nobody cared, which is, for a lot of games, way worse than people just hating it. People genuinely just weren't interested. And they've had other projects, of course, as well, many of which never saw the light of day, like the Last of Us Online project, and those ended up just getting scrapped. And maybe we'll see them eventually with like The Last of Us Part 3 as an optional multiplayer mode that they launched day and date or something like that. But that project represented years and years of work. By some metrics, I mean, at the very least, tens upon tens of millions of dollars, quite possibly over $100 million, were spent on the development of that online game that isn't releasing. And there's many other stories behind the scenes that we haven't even heard about of projects that have been canned. Initially, they were going for like 12 of these live service games. It gets cut down to 6. And so there's that side of PlayStation. And then there's this other side, the Astrobot side, the side of, you know, single player, very, very highly critically praised games. And quite clearly, people love them. Reviewers love them, which isn't everything, because, you know, who cares what a reviewer thinks? But it's pretty clear that there is a lot more excitement for something like an Astrobot than there is for another live service thing. And you would hope that maybe Sony gets the message that that's what players actually want, is they want games like like Astrobot and not like Concord, but they still seem to be doubling down on it. I mean, there's reporting that Sony is apparently, I've got it pulled up here, this is from NeoGAF, but some people put some of the reporting in here. But basically, there's reporting that Sony is very positive internally about Fair games. They expect this game to actually do really well, and they're really excited about it. And I know some people are like, ooh, so this is going to be different from Concord. Let me just remind you that Sony was very positive about Concord as well. So positive that they bought the company before they had ever released a single game. They bought the company before they had reached like the final development phase for Concord. They spent a lot of money for basically nothing. And they wouldn't have done that unless they were fairly positive, at least, about that project. So call me crazy. I don't put a lot of weight in their judgment. That being said, though, I think that this is just the most fascinating part of the industry right now, for me at least, is this duality within PlayStation of the pursuit of quick and easy cash through live service stuff, paired with what they demonstrably do well, which are these like single player, often like action adventure games, which are critically acclaimed and people eat them up and love them, but it's not enough for Sony, right? Like they want to crank it and do even more. And this is why, like, I think it's important for people to just remember that this is not like the live service stuff is not over with Concord. And bear in mind, Concord, we're all saying it's dead, but they did not say it was dead. They said they were removing it, they were shutting down servers, and then they were basically going to huddle up and figure out how to relaunch it. That's effectively what that message was. So they're just going to try again. I get the vibe they're going to launch it free to play, and they knew that launching it free to play while having just sold it for 40 or 60 bucks to people, that was just not going to work. So they refunded everybody that bought it, and they're going to launch it free to play. I think that's what they're going to do, and they're just going to try again. I don't personally expect it to work because I just don't know of a game that can have that much brand damage and then recover, but maybe they do a name change and they do stuff like that to help it. Either way, maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. It's kind of beside the point. The point is, Sony's not just like, well, we understand, we're moving on from this live service thing, we're going back to what we do really well. That's not what's happening. Concord for them was a flop, and I think a lot of them view it as a game that was bashed on unfairly, and they think that it's just a bunch of YouTubers and streamers that like riled up some anger towards it, and that's the only reason it failed. But I think it fundamentally misunderstands what's going on, which is that gamers within their tent, PlayStation gamers, just fundamentally don't like games like that. They just don't. And you know, it's the same thing with like YouTube. If you have an audience that really likes videos on like, I don't know, just like Call of Duty. If you're a Call of Duty YouTuber and then you come out and you post a walkthrough of Astro, even though Astrobot's a good game, even though the video I'm sure is going to be pretty good, your audience is going to be like, what the hell is this? Like, what are you doing? This isn't what we watch you for. And the video's not going to do very well. In the same way that like if I post an Animal Crossing 5-minute let's play tutorial on where to find like the best peach trees, that's not going to do well. And it's the same thing with Sony, where it's like you guys do this one thing really, really well, and yet you're trying to do almost the polar opposite. The only thing that would be more opposite is if it was like mobile games, if they were getting really, really into mobile games. But it just is this fascinating duality, this two-faced thing, where Sony wants to do this one thing they do really well, and they're still working on those things. They have a lot of single-player games coming down the pipeline, but then they're also still pursuing this live service thing. But it goes back to what we said like a year or two ago when these plans were first announced and communicated. PlayStation's approach is to throw a bunch of crap at the wall and see what sticks. And that's just how live service stuff works. You have to be ready to spend $2, $3, $4 billion on games, with $3.5 billion worth of that going straight down the drain, going nowhere. But if you have just one or two games pop off and they become really successful, they can be enough to keep your entire company afloat. I mean, Ubisoft right now is basically held together by Rainbow Six and I think Assassin's Creed probably, but everything else they do is pretty inconsistent. They have like Just Dance and stuff, but those games are not anywhere near as big as they used to be. And so you really only need one or two huge franchises to keep a multi-billion-dollar company together. And that's pretty clearly what Sony's hoping for, is to just get a couple of those big behemoths that pop off. And I'm not sure exactly how much money like Helldivers 2 is making, but I'm sure it's just fine. But I think there's going to be a lot of frustration in the coming like year or two, because we're going to get like a trailer for Ghost of Tsushima 2. And it's going to be right next to a trailer for Fair Games. And people are going to be like, what the hell is this? Like, Aren't you doing that thing? Why are you also doing that? Like, this sucks. We want that. And it's going to be really, really interesting to see how the audience kind of reacts to those types of reveals, because I think there's going to be a lot of them. They're going to start sandwiching this stuff in. There's other stuff they're working on, like the Horizon online game, for example. That's going to be big. They've spent years and years and years and years working on that. Apparently, all of Guerrilla is working on it now. They have hundreds and hundreds of employees working on it. That represents a massive investment for Sony. And if that Horizon project doesn't take off, I mean, that for them is going to be potentially the actual nail in the coffin, because that represents one of their actual like top proven studios. And if they can't get that working, then that'll be a big problem. Whereas Fair Games, I think they could hand wave it away as, well, it's a new team, so maybe the audiences weren't ready for it or whatever. But I just think we're at a very, very interesting point in the industry. Sony's undergoing a lot of change, frankly. And so is Microsoft. Microsoft's totally changing their like business model. And I think this next generation is going to be crazy. But I think these next few years specifically are going to be particularly fascinating, because you're going to see these companies trying to figure out how the hell to walk this line and balance this tightrope. And I think, unfortunately, like there's going to be a lot of games that just fall into the cracks as they figure this out. Games that would otherwise be really solid or even good, but they just came out at the wrong time, were marketed poorly, and because of those reasons, it just was a perfect storm. And to a certain extent, I think Concord could fit into that space. But then, on the flip side, other games like Astrobot pop off and are amazingly well received. So you just never really know like why exactly the sentiment is going to play out the way that it does. But I think in general, PlayStation gamers just want more Astrobots and less Concords and Fair Games. And I think they're going to continue voting with their wallets. And if they do that, maybe eventually Sony gets the message. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on the bizarre duality that has been awoken in my mind with Astrobot. Thanks for watching.